Hey everybody, this video is going to be on the science of addiction, which is a very important thing to understand if you have addiction, what's going on in your body and your brain, why it's happening, but it's also a lot of information. So I'm going to try and limit this to be as short as I can make it, and I'm also going to be using information from this booklet. This booklet, I have copies of this if you want one of these. And you can also get it for free on this website, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They made this really nice booklet that's got a ton of detailed information in it, and I'm going to use facts from here so I don't get anything wrong, so I don't give you any misinformation, but I'm also going to be just telling you things from my experience as a drug counselor, okay? So the first thing is that with addiction in our society, we have, for centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years, thought that addiction was a moral failing, that it's a weakness that people are using just because they don't, they're not strong enough, they're not smart enough, they're not this, they're not that. People didn't understand why addiction was a thing. They didn't understand why someone would drink a lot and someone wouldn't drink that much at all. Why someone could drink a lot and it would cause a lot of problems in their life, and then someone drink the same amount and not have it cause any problems. So they just guessed, especially because religion and spirituality being a thing, they guessed it must have been a moral failing. It must have been God saying that you're not doing good enough, right? That shaped how society views it, and to this day we're still trying to get rid of people's opinions and the stigma about addiction in our society, because people still hold on to that belief that it's a moral failing. But I'm here to tell you that it's not a moral failing. And if you still have family or friends that are feeling that way, that are believing that, please show them this video. We have officially stated and cited, and the Surgeon General themselves has said that addiction is a disease. It is a brain disease, okay? It is a disease just like something like diabetes or cancer, and if we change our views on it, then we can start treating people more fairly. We can start treating people with dignity and respect instead of treating them with shame and stigma and just shaming them and throwing them in jail. If we treat it like a disease, we can get more support and lessen the stigma, okay? So even though we have come a long way, we're not there quite yet, and we're hoping to get there soon, okay? So why are we studying this? Why am I talking about this? Mainly for you guys. People have been affected by this that are watching this video, a lot of people that we see, but even if you haven't been affected, you probably know somebody in your community, in your family, your friends that have struggled with some type of addiction. So what is addiction? The definition of this, I'm going to read this, says addiction is defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use, despite harmful consequences. It is considered a brain disease because drugs change the brain, they change its structure and how it works. These brain changes can be long-lasting and can lead to harmful behaviors seen in people who abuse drugs. We even say things like food is a drug, medications are drugs because they change the structure of the brain, and people can easily become addicted to food just like they can become addicted to substances, right? We just tend to stigmatize the people with drug and alcohol addictions more than other addictions, but any of them can become addictions, okay? Why do people take drugs? So just like with food, people overuse and use chemicals or behaviors for a lot of different reasons. So this isn't just drugs, this is things like oversleeping, overeating, sex, gambling, shopping. This is anything that makes us feel good can become addictive, right? So in general, people take drugs for a variety of reasons. It says to feel good is the most popular thing. When substances give us feelings of pleasure, we want to do them again. When we shop and get pleasure, we want to do it again. Our brain remembers that we like that thing, and it wants us to do it again to get that same feeling, right? So when we first experiment with drugs, maybe like we're in high school or something, or middle school, and we feel good about it, our brain wants us to do it again. If we have a horrible experience with that substance when we first try it, like if you drink and you just get so violently sick for the first time, you're going to be less likely to want to do it again. It doesn't mean that you won't do it again and that next time it might be more enjoyable, but you'll be less likely to want to, okay? So it says here as well, different drugs cause different effects that make us feel good, but especially ones that are stimulants cause these great feelings of euphoria, feelings of power, self-confidence, increased energy. Meth is a stimulant, and that's a very popular drug of choice in our county, and for those reasons. I've had a lot of people tell me that they started meth use because it helped them at work, it helped them be more productive, helped them be a better mother, better father. They had more energy to take care of their kids, and like I said, in the man and woman roles, to do it all. They could do it all using that drug, right? But other drugs such as depressants like heroin and alcohol can cause someone to feel relaxed and to feel satisfied, and which is also euphoric in itself, and it feels good. People also use drugs to feel better. They want relief from things in their lives. They want relief from their day-to-day stressors, their boredom, their loneliness, their anxiety. And we see in our field here at CMH a lot of people coming with trauma. They want to relieve the symptoms of trauma. They don't want to think about the memories anymore. They don't want the nightmares. They don't want the feelings that come up with it, okay? There's a very high percentage of people that we see that have trauma. Another reason people use is to do better with things. They want to do better in school with their performance. And, obviously people take steroids for a reason, to improve athletic performance. But it could also be things like someone has ADHD and they want to do better in school. They want to do better at work. And so they end up, maybe starting with ADHD medications like Ritalin and Adderall, and then move on to meth. We have a lot of people, like I said, that use meth in this county, and a lot of them actually have undiagnosed ADHD. And when they use meth, it doesn't key them up or jack them up. It makes them more calm and focused to a point. They can use a little meth and feel that way, and then if they use too much meth, it's out the window, right? Things just get all screwed around, and it's hard to use a little bit of meth, right? Other people use drugs for curiosity because other people are doing it. Very traditional peer pressure kind of thing. Everyone was doing it. My friends do it. I learned from my parents, this is what you do. This is my social circle, right? And it can turn into more after that. But some people only use because their friends are doing it. And then when they get out of that friend group, or like maybe somebody moves away, they just stop using drugs. It's like a phase. Maybe some people only use in middle school and high school. Maybe some people only use in college. Then they grow up and they stop. And that it is what it is. Not everybody that uses drugs and alcohol becomes addicted to it, right? Okay. So why is it such a problem then if all of these positive things are happening when someone uses drugs? Why is it a big deal? Why am I talking about it? It says when people first use a drug, they experience pleasure most of the time. Like I said, not everybody does, but a lot of people seem to perceive positive effects from it, and they feel good. Also, people, when they first use, can control the use. You can use on a Saturday night, put it down, not pick it up for months and months and months, so they don't think that the substance use is that big of a deal because it's in their control still, right? It says, however, though, drugs can quickly take over a person's life. That's especially true with something like meth, especially true with heroin, these very strong, intense drugs that gives this very, very strong euphoria. And if the drug use continues, other pleasurable activities become less pleasurable, which I'll explain why in a minute, and drug use becomes necessary for the person to feel normal. It also becomes part of their daily routine, their habit. They wake up every day and their schedule revolves around drugs. So they stop using, it's hard to make a new schedule. People start to compulsively seek drugs and take drugs to feel better, and that causes tremendous problems for them and their loved ones, which I'll talk about more too in a minute. And some people start to build a tolerance, which means that they need to take a higher dose or more frequent doses to get the same effect as they had when they first started. And that's, one of the signs of addiction. That's one of the things we talk about when we talk about addiction. And that's a very common thing. We might not mean to become addicted to something. We start off with small doses. We start off only on Saturdays. And then all of a sudden we need to use on Sundays. And then all of a sudden we need to use a little bit more than we did. Instead of 2 beers, now we need 4 beers. It can spiral like that. It's very slow seeming, but before you know it, you might not have control of the situation, and you might need to use every day multiple times a day to get the same effect that you did. And if you don't use, you have to go through withdrawal, which is a very crappy feeling, and nobody wants that, and our bodies want to avoid that feeling, right? It says also that even if you're only using moderately, not that often, if you're like a social drinker, there can still be a lot of negative consequences. If someone even only drinks once a month, but that person drives a car that once a month, they can kill somebody, they can get a DUI from it, right? That's impaired driving, and it can really affect someone's life. Maybe they become aggressive every time they drink. Even if they only drink once a month, they can hurt somebody that way, okay? So when somebody first starts using any substance, it's of their own free will. They choose to use that substance, okay? They choose to, hopefully it's of someone's own free will. That might not always be true. I shouldn't say that. Sometimes people are forced to take things. I apologize. But regularly, it's of the person's own free will, and they are choosing to use the substances. They have self-control still, okay? But it says that over time, the brain changes, its structures change, like I mentioned, which is what drugs do to the brain, and there are physical changes in the area of the brain that are critical to judgment, decision-making, learning, memory, and behavior control. Scientists believe that these changes alter the way the brain works and may help explain the compulsive and destructive behaviors of addiction, right? That makes a lot of sense. If we can't make good decisions anymore, we don't have good impulse control anymore, then we make worse decisions when it comes to substances. And our brain actually, the addicted part, will say to somebody, this is a good idea to use substances, and here's why. You can get away with it. No one's going to know that you use substances. And I'm going to do a whole thing on relapse justifications as well. But you're not really addicted. People are just jealous of how much fun you're having. It will just make any excuse that it can to justify someone's use. And that's loss of control. Another thing is, when we want to feel good, our brain yells at us. And I'll talk about the different parts of the brain in a second. But our brain convinces us that it's okay to go feel good and go do it, so that and that feeling is stronger than our logic, is what I'm trying to say. That feeling will always be stronger than our logic, and so it's easier to give into it than it is to sit there and think about things logically, okay? So the next section is about why do some people become addicted to drugs and why do some people not, and that's a very important section. So first thing I want to say is, a lot of people say something to the effect of, I have an addictive personality, right? And I understand why people say that. They have constantly had issues with impulse control throughout their lives, with abusing substances throughout their lives, maybe having a difficult time saying no throughout their lives, but there actually is no addictive personality. People are not born and just like from the womb, you're addicted to drugs. That's not how it works. Somebody is not born with an addictive personality. However, there are risk factors and protective factors, which means risk factors are things that make us more vulnerable to addiction, and protective factors help us avoid addiction, that everybody has from the time they're born, and they just increase the longer we live, okay? And I'm going to tell you what those are, because that's very important. So, some risk factors for developing an addiction. The first is our genes, is a biggie. So that's the thing where if somebody in your family has had a previous addiction, your grandfather, your uncle, your brother, your mom, your dad, right? We have a higher chance of becoming addicted. They have particularly found actually in our DNA, there are sections of DNA that can tell whether you have an increased risk for becoming addicted or not in our DNA. And it says that our genes, our DNA, can actually, how do I want to say this? It's a 40 to 60%, we can tell 40 to 60% in somebody. It determines 40 to 60% in somebody whether they can become addicted or not. So that's a pretty big percentage of a chance, but it doesn't mean just because you have somebody in your family that's addicted that you're automatically going to become addicted. That's not what it means at all, okay? There's a lot of other risk factors that put someone at risk. So other risk factors include having aggressive behavior in childhood, lacking parental supervision, and I would also say having dysfunction in the household along with lacking parental supervision. You see people using drugs and alcohol in the household, you see domestic violence, you have trauma when you're a young child. Like I mentioned, a lot of people end up having trauma. You don't have, someone's not teaching you good coping skills or how to manage your emotions. There's a lot of fighting, things like that. Poor social skills, drug experimentation when someone is young, availability of drugs at school, and then poverty, community poverty, how impoverished the whole community is, not just your household, the whole community. Because what that tends to do is it tends to limit resources. Impoverished communities have less resources in them, and they have less, honestly, they have less energy and time and availability to manage things like emotion, like they don't have emotional coping skills as much because their goal is to survive day to day. They're trying to get to work and to make money. They're not trying to learn how to become a better communicator and go to family therapy necessarily, right? It's just not as accessible to them. Some protective factors are having good self-control, and that is something we are taught a lot of times, right? Sometimes people are born with more personality traits that help them have more self-control, just like being responsible may be a personality trait, but self-control is also taught very much. Parental monitoring and support and love and unconditional love, no put downs, no cutting you down or calling you names, loving you unconditionally. Having boundaries though to say, so you can learn when you're doing something you shouldn't be doing and when you're doing good. Having positive relationships with like peers, family members, teachers, having doing well in school, so that can give someone a lot of self-confidence if they do well in school, and vice versa. If they don't do well in school, that can be a risk factor. The school having anti-drug policies, so they monitor drugs and there's not a lot of drugs coming in and out of the school, so a kid wouldn't have as much access to drugs. Neighborhood pride, which means, the neighborhood, instead of the poverty, the neighborhood comes together, they support one another, and that can happen even in a neighborhood that's impoverished, but they have a lot of more resources and things like that, and they can focus on healing. Coping skills, having those when you're a kid, learning what coping skills are, learning in school, learning from your family. The problem is, and I've said this probably before in videos, we don't learn those in school. Most of the time there's not like a class that's about coping skills, so unless you're taught in your family, it's hard to get them. You just don't get them. And then having resources, like I mentioned, in the community, okay? So when people say they have an addictive personality, a lot of times what they mean is some things like that. They're more impulsive. Being more sociable can also be a risk factor. Having more like tendency to want to do adrenaline-based activities, like having more need to do adrenaline stuff, being more curious, those things can also be risk factors too, okay? But also risk factors like using early on. Someone uses drugs earlier in their development, they're more likely to have an addiction later on, which I'll talk about in a second. But ultimately, it's not just one thing that leads to addiction, okay? We have biology, of course, that contributes to it, our genes, but it's also our environment. And then on top of that, it's our choices, the choices we make. Even if we've had a crappy environment growing up, we've had several people in our family that have had addictions, our choices ultimately will determine whether we have an addiction or not. And like I said, the first time someone's using, they usually make that choice of their own free will, and then they can choose to stop before it gets bad. But once it gets bad, they lose control, and then it's very difficult to stop without support and help, and honestly without a lot of consequences, okay? So with growing up and using drugs, everyone, I don't know, there's kind of mixed perceptions on this. In the clinical world, like our world, if someone uses drugs early on, it's more of a risk factor. There's been a lot of studies on it, and these are the reasons why, and I'm going to read this. So, you probably have heard, the brain doesn't stop maturing until 20 or later, okay, like 26 or something for females. I don't know the exact thing, but the brain is still growing and maturing at that point. So when a kid is still developing and they're using drugs, it really affects, it says, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that enables us to assess situations, make sound decisions, keep our emotions and desires under control. The fact that this critical part of an adolescent's brain is still a work in progress puts them at increased risk for making poor decisions, such as trying drugs, continuing to use drugs. Also, introducing drugs during this period of development may cause brain changes that are long-lasting, and they could affect the brain for the person's rest of that life. They might not be able to overcome that change in the brain. It says abusable substances at this age, using them can disrupt brain function in areas critical to motivation, memory, learning, judgment, and behavior control. So it's not surprising that teens use alcohol and other drugs often have more problems in their lives. They have more involvement with the justice system. They have more health problems later on. They have more family problems later on. It is putting that person at a disadvantage. We want to give our brain as much of a chance as it can to grow the healthiest and the best it can. It stunts that person's brain growth, basically, okay? And I've often heard, and I've seen this too, if someone starts using when they're 12 and they continue use until they're 30, when I start meeting with that person, their emotional state is almost like that of a 12-year-old. They don't know how to control their emotions, okay? It's hard. They don't have the skills, and it has affected a part of their brain in a big way. It is harder for that person to make decisions, to not act on impulses. So it's not doing them any favors. And so it's very important to try and prevent your kids from using any substances. And if you are a kid yourself, to think about that fact and think about your genetics in your family. Do you need to risk becoming addicted at a young age, especially with all the problems that it can cause, right? And I'll talk about those in a second. So how does addiction affect the brain specifically? We have 3 parts of our brain. So I like this little image here. This is a brain, okay, hi. So first of all, we have the brain stem, which is this part of our brain, this back here. It connects the brain to the spine, and it's responsible for life-sustaining things, which means breathing, heart rate, respiration. If we lose our brainstem, it's cut, we're done, we're dead. You'd have to be kept alive by, machines. Then we have, over here, we have the higher functioning part of our brain, which they call the cerebral cortex. And I've already kind of said some of these other things. It's responsible for a lot of different stuff. It's responsible for our sight, our senses, basically. It's saying like our ability to hear, see, feel, taste. And then in the front of our brain here, we have the frontal cortex, which is all of the higher level stuff, like I mentioned, decision making, logic, reasoning, our ability to plan and problem solve, make decisions. Then inside of here, we have our limbic system. So it's in the middle of our head, basically, okay? That includes our brain's reward highways, or the reward circuit. It links together a number of brain structures that control and regulate our ability to feel pleasure, which is like its number one thing. It just wants to feel good, okay? Feeling pleasure motivates us to repeat behaviors that are necessary for our existence. So our brain has developed a limbic system so that we do things that are pleasurable to us, that are necessary for our survival. It gives us a good feeling. The chemical it releases is called dopamine when we do things that are necessary for survival. Those are things like eating, sleeping, sex, okay? That, sex is necessary for the species survival, because maybe we wouldn't do those things if they didn't feel good, right? And socializing is also on here. It says it's also responsible, the limbic system, for our perception of other emotions, both positive and negative. And so it's like the emotional part of the brain, right? That's very important. So how drugs work in the brain is, unfortunately, because it is unfortunate, they hijack the limbic system is what they do, okay? They take it over. What drugs do is they mimic the natural chemicals in our brain. So for example, it says Drugs affect the brain by tapping into the communication system. They interfere with how we send, receive, and process information. They also mimic structures of the transmitters, like dopamine is a transmitter, a neurotransmitter. So we're, how do I explain this? Yeah, it says it fools our brain into thinking the drugs are the transmitters, and it releases chemicals. So, which one of those is dopamine, okay? But it releases dopamine in way greater amounts than our regular dopamine. Because like I said, when we eat or drink, sleep, sex, socializing, even things like shopping, because it's almost like hunting and gathering, when we're doing things necessary for our survival, we get some dopamine inside of us. But that's a natural amount of it. When we're using drugs, it says it's about 2 to 10 times the amount of dopamine that the natural rewards give us, which is way stronger, especially something like meth. I heard they were measuring like units of substances. It's like 150 units for a cheeseburger, and it's like 2,000 units for meth. And it lasts a lot longer than a cheeseburger feel-good feeling lasts, right? So our brain remembers this, and it loves feeling pleasure, like I said, so it's going to love that feeling and going to remember that feeling, okay? And especially like a stimulant, it will release the dopamine in huge proponents or proportions, okay? How do they do this? How do drugs flood the system with this, right? They create more dopamine. They mimic chemicals in our brain that make it so we will produce more dopamine. And let me see what it says here. And then what ends up happening is, I kind of like this picture. Okay. So this, I don't know how you can see this. This little picture shows what I'm saying right here. So while we're eating food, that's the dopamine that's being released into our receptors. And it's a little bit, feels pretty good. But cocaine, which would be very similar to meth, cocaine blocks the areas the dopamine is supposed to get sucked back up into. And so there's just a ton of dopamine hanging out in your brain. And it's not going anywhere. The brain is supposed to take the dopamine back up, reuptake is what it's called, into the brain to use for later, and the cocaine, meth, they don't allow that to happen. So the dopamine's just sitting in your brain for longer. So what ends up happening is that after a lot of time of using, our brains don't give us our own natural dopamine anymore because they don't need to. Like it changes the natural systems of the brain. So we don't need to produce our own dopamine anymore. We don't need to release our own dopamine anymore. We can just rely on meth to do it. So it's like a factory. The factory shut down in your brain, and they let meth do what it's doing, and it feels great. Tolerance is being built at this time too, so we need more of the drug to get the same effect, the same pleasurable feeling as we did. And a lot of people say they don't even get the same effect as they did when they first were using. They're always chasing it. And then when somebody stops using, then there's no dopamine. There's nothing. The factories are already closed down. They've been abandoned for years. They got nothing. So that means they feel like crap. They feel depressed. They feel like less pleasure in activities. They feel less motivated, less energy. And the brain goes, you know what would be good and sounds good and would give me some pleasure? Drugs and alcohol. So it gives people the feeling of a craving, okay? Just making sure I'm getting some of this stuff. They feel flat, lifeless, depressed, all of those things. And over time, the dopamine will start producing again. The factories will turn back on, but it takes time. It's not instant. It's not instant. You don't stop using drugs and the next day you feel better. It's months and months and months. And it's really hard for people. They don't want to do it. They want to avoid that. So they just keep using. Okay? So, but it will come back. Okay? It will come back. So how does long-term drug taking affect brain circuits? This is good to know. So yeah, it says over the long term, using can severely affect the brain circuits, neurons, and it can compromise the long-term health for the brain, which makes sense, of course. So here's some ways that it does that. It affects our ability to learn, our ability to concentrate, cognitive function overall that it can affect, memory, of course, which you probably have seen if you've been a long-term user. It can really affect memory. Learning changes into, instead of trying to like learn day to day, learn in your job, learning becomes focused on learning where someone can get drugs, how they can get drugs, and then when they stop using, their brain is still focused on that. Their brain remembers where they could get drugs and how they could get drugs, and that's a trigger. That's called a trigger, and it causes a craving. It's almost like a reflex. Even if someone's been sober for years, they could pass by a place they haven't been to and feel just like that, a craving for drugs, because they were triggered by the thing. And they say, of course, triggers are people, places, and things. And I'm going to do another video on that so I can explain that more to you guys too, okay? So, medical things can happen, of course, as a result of addiction. You know, some of you might know this already, but just things like lung disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer, mental health disorders. It can cause issues with anything, any system of the body, the brain. It can, you know, the risky things people do during use can lead to hepatitis C, teeth, you know, issues, of course. I've even had people tell me their eyesight has gotten much worse after using. And then there's this whole thing about mental illness. So, you know, which comes first? Does addiction cause mental illness, or mental illness cause addiction? Both. Both things can happen. It can be either one. Someone that has like a anxiety disorder might start using to get rid of the anxiety, and it could make their anxiety worse, but they think it's relieving it. Vice versa, someone that has an addiction could end up getting a lot of trauma because of the things that are happening in their addiction, or they can become depressed. It's like chicken or the egg, you know, both are accurate. Other things that can harm, of course, is infants. If someone's using while they're pregnant, it can really be harmful to them. And in general, like, it can harm families, you know. The behaviors that people do when they're in addiction are things that they think are necessary to survive. Because, like I had said, the brain gives us dopamine when we do things that are necessary for survival. So what the brain ends up doing with drugs is it ends up thinking that we need that thing to survive. Anyone that's been in withdrawal knows that feeling of, holy crap, if I don't get this thing, I'm going to die. Especially with things like heroin. But in alcohol, all of it. So the brain links those two together, where if I don't have my thing that I want, this pleasurable thing, then I need to go get it, or else I'm going to die, right? Even if it's just like, I'm going to feel miserable, they want to avoid that, and the brain tells you to avoid it. So people will do things that they wouldn't normally do. Lying, cheating, stealing, manipulating, right? Not good things, not good choices, and they hurt families, they hurt the person. It leads to a lot of shame after someone's gone through an addiction. It can lead to a lot of legal issues, obviously, but that is not that person's fault. That person has lost control. That person would not normally do those things most of the time. I mean, some people, you know, just do bad things because they do bad things, but people that have addictions do bad things because they feel like they have to do those bad things, okay? That's very necessary to know that. Okay. Then, lastly, what do we do about this? Like, now that we know someone's got an addiction and why they have an addiction, what the hell do we do? So, treatment, you know, and that's where we come in. And this is very important. If you are like, you know what, I really want to stop this before it gets worse, I'm feeling like it's getting out of control, or it is out of control, and I know it's out of control, and I want to stop it before I get picked up at a legal charge, come to see us. You know, our number is in our information, in our bio, and it can be treated. We have a lot of different types of treatment that can help with this, and I'm going to do another video about those things, but it can be treated, and someone can go into remission from it, just like they can with cancer, but it cannot be cured in the sense that somebody can go into treatment and then not use for years and years and years, or maybe their whole lifetime, never use again. But chronic diseases such as diabetes and cancer always have the risk of coming back, and so addiction also has the risk of coming back, and relapse would be the way that would look. So relapse is not a failure. Relapse is not a moral failing. Again, it is, just like anything else, a symptom of this disease, okay? And it says, if someone goes to treatment, the treatment can help prevent relapse and help the person regain control of their brain and control their lives. But as I mentioned, the limbic system is hijacked, which, remember, is this part of the brain here. And so this is hijacked and controlling the brain. People are making decisions based off of their emotions and what's pleasurable versus the higher part of someone's brain here where it's decision making. Unfortunately, as much as dopamine gets shut down in the brain, logic gets shut down too. So if someone's been using for a very long time, their logic gets shut down. They've done studies on this, they've done brain scans. This is not lighting up anymore as much. It's not working as well as it used to. So people, even when they stop using, do not automatically know how to make good decisions. They do not automatically know how to take care of themselves. And they don't automatically have access to this part of their brain as they once might have. So, relapse is very common. So is making bad decisions. So is still having unhealthy relationships, unhealthy behaviors. And that's going to take a minute for this to turn back on, for dopamine to come back, and for people to learn the skills that they need to stay sober. And that's why treatment is not usually just 1 or 2 days. It can be months. But after those months, you can really have all the tools you need. And I'm also going to say this about people that have been to prison, is I hear this all the time. Well, I had a class in prison. I've been sober for 3 years. Well, you have not used in 3 years maybe, and maybe you did have one class. But a lot of times it's not enough. It's not everything somebody needs to stay sober, because sobriety is holistic, meaning it's about every part of someone's life. It is healing their soul, their relationships, their finances, their communication, their coping skills, as well as not using. So it's just making everything healthier, and which makes it a lot more likely that person's going to stay sober for a long term and not relapse, okay? So if you have friends or family members that you think are struggling and they need help, please have them call us. Our number is in the information, and I'll put it in the description below as well. And if they can't see us, we can find another resource for them in this county, okay? Thank you guys, and good luck.